She carried the child through the north wing, with her shoulder pressed against doors that had not been opened in years, and the girl in her arms was still breathing, but only just. Rosalind Kestrel, Duchess of Marchbrook for 11 months, trained nurse before that, and in this moment neither, had found Nell Hodges collapsed at the colourworks gate in the last grey light of a March evening, and she had not stopped to ask permission or send for anyone. Because the girl's lips were the colour of old wax, and her fingers were cold, and there was no time. The north wing was locked. The sick room at the end of it was locked twice over, kept that way by a man who called it grief, and had not let anyone inside it since November 1847. Rosalind had taken the housekeeper's key without asking, and now she pushed the door open with her shoulder and carried Nell Hodges, 11 years old and 32 pounds lighter than she should have been, into the warmest room on that side of the house. The only room with water and a working lamp and a window seat broad enough to lay a child flat. She set Nell down on the velvet of the window seat. She turned to find water, and then the girl vomited onto the floorboards, and what came up was a liquid the exact green of the walls. Rosalind did not move for 3 full seconds. She looked at the floor, and then she looked at the walls, painted in a shade that had seemed, when she first entered Marchbrook as a bride, merely fashionable and slightly cold. And she understood something she could not yet prove. She knelt and pressed 2 fingers to Nell's wrist, counted the pulse, and was reaching for the water pitcher when she heard footsteps in the corridor. Ambrose Kestrel, Duke of Marchbrook, appeared in the doorway. He was in his evening coat, which meant he had come from the library, which meant someone had told him the sick room key was gone. He stood in the frame and looked at the child on his first wife's daybed, and at his second wife kneeling on the floor beside her. And his face did what it always did when something moved him past his own management. It went very still. "Remove her," he said. "Remove her from this room." Rosalind did not look up. She was checking Nell's temperature with the back of her hand against the girl's forehead. "She needs warmth and light," Rosalind said. "This is the only room on this wing with both. I will not ask you again." "Then don't ask me." Rosalind looked up at him then, directly. "Look at the floor, Your Grace. Name the color. Then look at the walls and ask yourself why it is the same." He looked. He said nothing. "I am going to find milk and sodium carbonate," Rosalind said, standing. "If you wish to carry her out yourself while I am gone, that is your choice. But I would ask you to look at her first and decide whether you are willing to be the man who moved a sick child from the only warm room available to her." She walked past him in the doorway and did not wait for his answer. Behind her, in the room, she heard nothing. No footsteps, no movement, no sound of the door being closed again. She walked down the corridor toward the servants' stairs and did not permit herself to think about what the green on the floor meant, not yet, because Nell Hodges was still breathing, and that was the only fact that mattered in this moment. Nell was alive the next morning. Rosalind had the housekeeper make up a bed in the servants' quarters, a real bed, with blankets, not a pallet. And by noon, the girl was awake and asking for water in a voice so thin it barely carried across the room. Rosalind sat beside her and asked careful questions. How long had she worked the drying room? Since Christmas. Had others been sick? Her brother Tom had been sick for 3 weeks. Were there other children in the drying room? 14, she thought. Maybe more. That afternoon, Rosalind went to Ambrose's study and knocked. He answered from within. "Come." She entered and stood before his desk. He was working through correspondence and did not look up immediately. "I need access to the works ledgers," Rosalind said. The production records, the employment rolls, and the medical logs, if Dr. Pemberton keeps them. Ambrose set down his pen. He looked at her with the expression she had learned to read in 11 months of marriage. Not unkind, precisely, but sealed. "The works are not your concern," he said. "Nell Hodges worked the drawing room from Christmas until last Friday," Rosalind said. "She is 11 years old. She vomited green on the floor of the north sick room. I would like to know what she has been handling." "The drying room uses standard pigment processes. Pemberton monitors the workers' health." "Then Pemberton's records will show nothing alarming," Rosalind said, "and you will have lost nothing by letting me see them." He did not answer that directly. He said instead that the ledgers were not kept for household review, and that if she had concerns about a worker's health, she was welcome to raise them with the works physician at his next scheduled visit. Rosalind looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Very well," and left. On day 3, she walked to the colourworks without leave or announcement, at 7 in the morning, and spent 2 hours inside before anyone thought to send for Pemberton. By the time the works physician arrived, a compact man of 63, with the careful eyes of someone who has been managing information for a long time, she had already counted 23 workers showing symptoms she recognized. The tremor in the hands, the pale gums, the wasting. She had counted 14 children in the drying room, the youngest no more than 7. Their fingers stained the same green she had seen on Nell Hodges' lips. Pemberton handed her a written notice at the gate. It cited factory regulations. It bore his signature and a clause barring her from the premises for 30 days. It had been prepared in advance. She folded it and put it in her pocket and walked back to the house. She had 30 days. She would use them. Ambrose did not lift Pemberton's ban on day 4. He did not lift it on day 5 or day 6. His silence on the matter was complete and apparently effortless, as if the question had never been raised. Rosalind marked this. She had learned, in 11 months, that Ambrose's silences were not passive. They were chosen, each one a decision dressed as the absence of one. He was a man who could carry a thing for years without putting it down. And she was beginning to understand that the locked sick room in the north wing was not the only thing he had been carrying. On day 8, Tom Hodges died. He was 9 years old. Rosalind was in the room, a low cottage at the end of the Works Village Lane, 2 rooms, a fire that barely drew, when Pemberton arrived and opened his certificate book. She watched him write. She read the words upside down across the table. Wasting fever. She looked at Tom Hodges' hands, which were still faintly stained at the fingernails, and at the slight greenish cast along his jaw that she had seen on 3 other workers in the past week, and she said nothing. Because there was nothing she could say in that room that would change what Pemberton was writing. Ambrose was at the door. He had come himself. She had not expected that. And he stood in the frame with his hat in his hands and said nothing to Pemberton and nothing to the certificate and nothing to her. His face was doing the still thing again. She could not tell, looking at him, whether the stillness was guilt or grief or simply the practiced composure of a man who had been doing this long enough that it no longer cost him visible effort. She went home and did not speak to him at supper. That night, after the house was quiet, Rosalind went to the north sick room. She brought a small knife and 2 paper packets. She scraped a sample from the drying room floor. She had taken it that morning before Pemberton arrived, wrapped in a square of brown paper in her coat pocket. She scraped a second sample from the paint on the sick room wall, from a low corner near the window where the paint had bubbled slightly from the damp. She wrapped them separately, labeled them in her clearest hand, and sealed them with wax. In the morning, she placed them with the post coach to Birmingham. addressed to an independent analytical chemist whose name she had found in a 3-year-old copy of a scientific journal in the Marchbrook library. She stood in the yard and watched the coach leave. The March air smelled of wet stone and something faintly metallic that she had stopped noticing until now. Her marriage was an open file. She knew it as clearly as she had ever known anything. Whatever Ambrose had been protecting with his silence, whatever he had decided, long before she arrived, was worth protecting. She was no longer inside that decision with him. She was standing on the other side of it, and Tom Hodges was dead, and the coach was already past the gate. Barred from the works for 30 days, Rosalind built a different kind of access. She borrowed the housekeeper's copying paper and began a ledger of her own. Names, dates, symptoms, the last day each person had worked the drying room. She persuaded 3 workers' wives to come to the servants' wing each morning and tell her what they had observed. Mrs. Crane, whose husband had the hand tremor. Mrs. Fallow, whose youngest son had stopped eating in February. Mrs. Hodges, Nell's mother, who came because she had nothing left to lose and sat at the kitchen table and spoke in a flat, careful voice and answered every question Rosalind asked without being asked twice. The ward in the servants' wing was unofficial and unpowered by anything except Rosalind's nursing training and the housekeeper's tacit cooperation. She had no authority to be there. She did it anyway. On day 14, Ambrose crossed the sick room threshold for the second time. Rosalind was trying to move Nell from the window seat to the proper bed that had been brought in, and Nell was heavier than she looked when dead weight, and Rosalind was losing the angle. She heard him come in. She did not ask for help. He crossed the room without being asked, took the girl's weight from the other side, and for a few seconds, his hands and hers were both under Nell's back at the same time, fingers nearly touching in the narrow space between the child's shoulder blades. He let go first, once Nell was settled, and stepped back and said nothing and left. Rosalind straightened the blanket over Nell and did not turn around to watch him go. On day 19, a child's funeral in the works village, not Tom, a younger girl, 6 years old, from one of the drying room families. Rain on the churchyard, the kind of cold March rain that comes sideways off the hills and finds the gap between collar and skin. Rosalind stood at the graveside in her second-best coat and felt the rain soak through the shoulders before the service was half done. She was aware of Ambrose standing some distance to her left, among the other mourners, not looking at her. When it was over and the families were moving toward the lane, she felt weight settle on her shoulders from behind, heavy, warm, smelling of wood smoke and wool. His coat. He had placed it over her without a word, and by the time she registered what had happened and turned, he was already walking toward the carriage, his back to her, his shoulders straight and bare in the rain. She stood in the churchyard, holding his coat around her shoulders, and did not follow him. She stood there for a full minute after the carriage had gone, because she needed the minute to understand what it meant that a man could make a gesture that generous and a silence that complete at the same time, and whether those two things could belong to the same person, and whether she had married that person believing she knew which one was real. On day 21, the letter from Birmingham arrived. Rosalind opened it at the kitchen table while Mrs. Crane was still in the room. She read it once, quickly, and then she read it again, slowly. Double positive. Arsenic confirmed in both samples. The drying room floor and the sick room wall. The chemist had included his methodology, his apparatus notes, and his professional signature. The report was 4 pages, and it was complete, and it required nothing from Ambrose to stand. It did not depend on his silence ending. It did not need his cooperation or his confession or his willingness to speak. It was true without him. She set it down on the table and Mrs. Crane looked at her face and asked no questions. On day 26, at 11 o'clock at night, Rosalind carried the chemist's report into Charlotte's sick room and set it on the drawing table under the lamp. She had sent no word ahead. She had simply gone. Ambrose was already there. She had wondered sometimes whether he came to this room at night, whether the locked door was also a habit, a ritual of some kind. And now she knew. He was standing at the window when she entered, and he turned, and he looked at the papers she was laying on the table, and he said nothing. 2 samples, Rosalind said. 1 from the drawing room floor, 1 from the paint on this wall. She smoothed the pages flat. Both positive for arsenic. The chemist's name is on the report. He has no connection to Marchbrook and no reason to lie. Ambrose came to the table. He read standing, which was how he always read things that mattered. She had noticed that in 11 months. He read the whole report without interrupting it. When he finished, he set it down and was quiet for a moment. And then he said something she had not expected. "There is a report from 1847, he said. "A chemist's report like this one. It is in the estate strongbox in my study, behind the household accounts." Rosalind looked at him. "You have had it for 5 years." He answered plainly, "Yes." "And the children have been in the drawing room for 5 years." "Not the same children." "No," she said. "Different ones." Tom Hodges was 9. How old were the children in 1847? He did not answer that. Instead, he said, "I can offer the sick families a pension, a private arrangement, no public record, no inquiry. I will pull the children from the drawing room tonight if you want them pulled. The report, your report, and the one in my study can both be destroyed before morning." He paused. "I am not asking you to pretend nothing happened. I am asking you to let me repair it quietly." His hands, she noticed, were not steady. He was gripping the edge of the table with both of them, and his knuckles were white. "Tell me the number," Rosalind said. He looked at her. "The number at which you would have stopped," she said. "Not the number where you thought it might become public, or the number where it became too expensive to ignore. The number at which you yourself would have said, 'This is too many. I cannot let another one happen.' Tell me that number, and I will burn both reports tonight myself, in front of you." The room was very quiet. The lamp on the drawing table made a small sound, the wick settling. Ambrose did not answer. He stood at the table for a long moment, and then he reached across and took her right hand, not roughly, not gently, simply deliberately, and turned it palm up in his. He looked at her fingernails. The green was there, faint but visible, from the samples she had scraped, from the days of handling the evidence, from a month of working in a room whose walls she now understood were themselves the crime. He looked at the green under her nails for a long, held moment. He did not clean it. He did not speak. He set her hand down and left the room. Rosalind stood alone in Charlotte's sick room with the chemist's report on the table and the lamp burning and the green walls around her. And she understood that he had not been able to say the number because there was no number. There had never been a number. He had been waiting for someone else to stop it. In the days after the confrontation, Ambrose moved. It was partial, private, and insufficient, but it was movement. 6 children were pulled from the drawing room roster by day 28. Rosalind noted this in her ledger. She noted also that by day 30, Pemberton had quietly returned 4 of the 6 to the work schedule, citing the production demands of the London shipment. The reversal took 8 days and left no written record. It proved to Rosalind with complete clarity that a private agreement, however sincerely offered, held nothing, not against Pemberton's interests, not against the London contract, not against the arithmetic of 70% of an estate's income. She needed a public record. She needed one before the shipment sailed. On day 33, she found Charlotte's portfolio. It had been stacked behind the window seat in the sick room, underneath a folded length of velvet, not hidden exactly, but placed where no one who was not looking would look. Inside was a sketchbook, and inside the sketchbook was a list of names in a woman's careful hand. Children's names, with dates beside each one. Rosalind recognized two of the names from Mrs. Hodges's account. The dates ran from the autumn of 1846 through the winter of 1847. At the back of the sketchbook, folded once, was a letter on plain paper addressed to Ambrose, dated the 14th of January, 1847. She read it standing. Charlotte had written in plain, unornamented sentences. She had written that she had spoken to 3 of the drawing-room children herself. She had written that she had counted the names of those who had been sick. She had written that she was asking him, not demanding, not threatening, simply asking, in the plainest language available to a woman of her position, to close the works. She had written that she would not ask him again after this letter, because she understood what the works meant to the estate's income, and she was not unaware of what she was asking. She had written that she trusted him to do what was right. The letter had never been answered. Rosalind stood in the room for a long time. She stood in the same room where Charlotte had stood, at the same window, with the same green walls around her, holding a letter that had been written to the same man who was now meeting her own questions with the same impenetrable quiet. Charlotte had asked. Charlotte had waited. Charlotte had trusted him to do what was right. And within the year, Charlotte was dead, and her death certificate said consumption, and her sick room was locked and called grief, and Ambrose had been calling her his true wife ever since. As if the shrine could retroactively become a tribute instead of what it actually was. Rosalind set the letter back in the sketchbook. She set the sketchbook back in the portfolio. She left the room, went to her own writing desk, and sat down. She was frightened. She knew exactly what she was about to do, and she knew exactly what it would cost, and she was frightened in the specific, bodily way she had learned to recognize in herself. The cold steadiness that settled in her hands when she was genuinely afraid and had decided to act regardless. She had felt it the first time she held a dying patient in a nursing ward at 23, and she felt it now. At 6 o'clock in the morning on day 34, she sent the formal complaint to the Board of Trade. Her full name, the chemist's report enclosed. No intermediary. On day 39, the Board of Trade fixed the inspection date, the 23rd of June. Rosalind received the confirmation letter at the Cooperage Rooms, where she was not yet living but would be. She read it and noted that the date gave her 65 days. She noted also that Ambrose's silence now had a public address and a room full of commissioners behind it. It was no longer a private matter between 2 people in a locked room at 11 at night. It was a matter of record. On day 41, Pemberton sent a written report to the Kestrel Family Council. Rosalind did not see the report itself, but she saw its effects within 2 days. The housekeeper came to her room and asked with evident discomfort for the household keys. The ring of keys that Rosalind had carried since the first week of her marriage. The keys that opened the linen room, the still room, the wine cellar, the servants' hall cabinet, every locked door in the domestic half of Marchbrook, was placed on the housekeeper's desk before noon. Pemberton had described her conduct as evidence of nervous excitability. The family council had acted on his description. On day 47, Lord Bertram Kestrel arrived from London. He was 71 years old and had been the head of the Kestrel family council since before Ambrose inherited. And he had the manner of a man who had been executing difficult decisions on behalf of other people's estates for so long that the difficulty had ceased to register. He presented the expulsion order in the front hall, with 4 council members present and the household staff visible in the corridor behind them. Rosalind read it standing. She asked no questions. She went upstairs and packed what she needed: her nursing instruments, her ledger, her correspondence, her own clothes, and came back down. The council was still on the steps when she reached the gate. She heard footsteps behind her, moving quickly, and then Ambrose was beside her. He did not speak. He took her hand, her right hand, the one he had turned palm up in the sick room 3 weeks earlier, and held it. She counted the seconds without meaning to. 26 of them, in front of his uncle and the council and everyone watching from the steps. He held her hand and said nothing and stopped nothing. And then he let go, and she walked through the gate. She found 2 rooms above a cooperage in the works village. The cooperage smelled of fresh wood and iron bands and the river, and the rooms were cold, and the ceiling was low, and they were hers. By the end of the first week, 3 workers' wives were bringing her their husbands and children each morning, and she was treating them on the table she had pushed against the wall under the window. By the end of the second week, the workers themselves had organized a collection, a laborer's weekly wage, brought to her door in a cloth bag by Mrs. Crane's eldest son. She accepted it. It was the most honest money she had ever held. On day 51, Rosalind heard what happened at the loading yard from Mrs. Crane, who had heard it from her husband, who had been standing 40 feet away when it happened. Ambrose had gone to the yard himself in the morning and had walked to the front of the 60 men already loading the London shipment and had told the yard foreman to stop. He had cancelled the contract himself in front of everyone, without explanation beyond the statement that the shipment would not sail. 70% of the estate's income gone in one sentence before 60 witnesses. He did not come to the cooperage rooms. He did not send word. He had acted on the pigment, and he had not yet acted on the silence. And Rosalind lay awake that night and understood the difference, and did not send for him. On day 63, she heard his footsteps on the cooperage stairs. He knocked. She opened the door, and he was standing on the landing with Charlotte's portfolio under his arm. And he looked at the 2 rooms behind her. The table with the nursing instruments, the 6 names in the ledger, the window with the river visible below. And then he looked at her. "I need to leave this with you," he said, and held out the portfolio. She took it and set it on the table. "Why here?" "Because Pemberton has the run of the house," Ambrose said. "He will burn what he can reach. He cannot reach here." He paused. "There is a surviving copy of the 1847 report inside the portfolio. I removed it from the strongbox on the 14th. The copy Pemberton has access to is the estate's duplicate. It is already gone, I expect, or will be by the end of the week. The original is there." Rosalind looked at the portfolio on the table. "You took it on day 14, she said, "the day you helped me move Nell." He confirmed it quietly. "Yes." "You have been carrying it for 7 weeks." His voice was steady. "Yes." She looked at him directly. "Why are you telling me this now and not 7 weeks ago?" "Because 7 weeks ago, I was still deciding whether I was going to speak at the commission or simply let your report stand alone," Ambrose said. He said it plainly, without the ceremonial precision he used in public, which was how she knew he meant it. "I have decided. I am going to speak. But if I come here after this, if I am seen visiting you before the commission, They will call you a coached wife and dismiss your testimony entirely. I will not cost you that." He stopped. "I will not see you again until the 23rd. The room was very quiet. The cooperage below made its low, steady sounds, wood and mallet and the river. "I am afraid," Rosalind said. She said it because it was true, and because she had learned, in 30 years of living with herself, that saying it aloud did not make it larger. Not of the commission, of the 60 days between now and then. He looked at her. His face was doing something she had not seen it do before. Not the stillness, not the ceremonial composure, but something underneath both of those. Something that had been waiting behind them for a long time. She kissed him. She stepped forward and kissed him, standing with Charlotte's portfolio between them on the table, because she was afraid and she had decided to do it anyway, which was how she did everything that mattered. He stayed. He did not leave before 2 in the morning, and when he left, he went quietly, and she did not hear the cooperage stairs after that for 41 days. She did not send for him. On day 68, a malpractice complaint was filed against her with the county medical board, citing unlicensed nursing practice. It was dismissed on day 79 on the grounds that she held valid charitable nursing credentials from a recognized institution, which was true and which Pemberton had apparently not verified before filing. On day 84, a charitable nursing society in Birmingham sent the first 6 beds to the cooperage rooms, folded flat and delivered by cart. She set them up herself with Mrs. Crane's help, and by evening had 3 of them occupied. On day 88, she learned from Mrs. Fallow, whose brother worked in the estate office, that Pemberton had burned something in the study grate the previous night. A document, several pages, the ashes raked before morning. She noted it in her ledger and felt nothing in particular, because the portfolio was on her table and the original was inside it, and Pemberton was burning the wrong copy. In the weeks before the 23rd, Rosalind took 22 written statements from workers and their families. She took them at the table under the window in the mornings, with Mrs. Crane present as a witness, and she wrote each one out in her clearest hand and had the worker sign or mark it. 22 statements, 41 names mentioned, 31 dates of death or serious illness, going back to 1846. She did not send for Ambrose. She did not look up from the table toward the cooperage stairs. She worked, and the ward grew around her, and the 23rd came closer. The morning of day 104 was a Monday in June, and the drying room at Marchbrook Colourworks smelled of copper and something sweeter underneath it. The particular sweetness that Rosalind had learned to associate with arsenic exposure in enclosed spaces, though she had not known to name it when she first walked into this room 9 weeks ago. 3 royal commissioners sat at a long table brought in for the purpose. Beside them, a chemist from London with a Marsh apparatus already assembled on a smaller table to the right. Dr. Pemberton sat at the far end, upright, his certificate book closed in front of him. 40 workers stood against the walls of the drying room. Men and women who had been asked to be present and had come, every one of them, without being told twice. Rosalind sat as the complainant, her 22 statements in a folder, her own ledger beside it. She had worn her plainest dress and her nursing institution badge, which she had not worn since her wedding. She was frightened, and her hands were perfectly still. The lead commissioner, a gray-haired man named Aldford, with the manner of someone who had seen a great deal and been surprised by very little, opened the proceedings and called Pemberton first. Pemberton spoke for 40 minutes. He was precise, thorough, and entirely calm. He stated that no chemist's report had been produced at Marchbrook in 1847 or at any other time prior to the complainant's filing. He stated that the works physician's records showed no pattern of arsenic-related illness among the workforce. He stated that the deaths recorded in the works village over the relevant period had been certified by himself according to standard medical practice, and that each certificate reflected his honest clinical assessment. He defended every signature. He did not look at Rosalind during any of this. Aldford asked 3 questions and noted the answers. The chemist from London was called to explain his Marsh apparatus and its methodology, which he did in approximately 12 minutes. Rosalind's report was entered into the record. Her 22 statements were entered into the record. She was asked to speak to her nursing credentials, her methodology in collecting the samples, and the timeline of her observations, and she answered each question in complete sentences. Clearly, without elaboration she hadn't been asked for. Then the door at the far end of the drying room opened, and Ambrose came in. He was carrying a leather portfolio. He set it on the commissioner's table without asking permission, and Aldford looked at him with the particular expression of a man recalibrating his expectations, and said, "Your Grace." "I have something to submit," Ambrose said. He opened the portfolio and began laying paintings across the table. Charlotte's botanical paintings, one after another, 41 of them, in their watercolor greens and blues, and the particular, beautiful, deadly shade of Paris green that Charlotte had used for leaves and stems and the fine detail of petals throughout her entire body of work. He laid them in rows until the table was covered. The room was very quiet. "I would ask the chemist," Ambrose said, "to run the Marsh test on the green pigment in the 17th painting." The chemist looked at Aldford. Aldford nodded. The chemist took the 17th painting, a study of lily of the valley, green stems, white bells, Charlotte's initials in the lower corner, and prepared his sample. The room waited. 40 workers stood against the walls and did not move. Pemberton sat at the far end of the table with his certificate book in front of him, and his face arranged in an expression of professional composure that was, Rosalind thought, the most expensive thing he had ever maintained. 11 minutes later, the arsenic mirror appeared in the Marsh apparatus. The chemist stated his finding aloud. For the record, he stated the concentration. He stated that it was consistent with the samples submitted by the complainant. Ambrose spoke. He spoke without notes. He spoke in the same plain, direct register he had used in the cooperage on day 63. Not the ceremonial voice, not the public voice, but the voice underneath. The one that came out when he was being honest and knew it was going to cost him. He stated that in the autumn of 1847, he had received a chemist's report linking the arsenic content of Marchbrook's Paris green pigment to the pattern of illness among the works employees. He stated that he had buried the report to protect a London contract. He stated that he had made payments to Dr. Pemberton, not for medical services, but for the certification of deaths he knew, or had reason to know, were not caused by the illnesses named on the certificates. He stated the number of false certificates, 31. He stated the number of deaths he now believed were attributable to the works, 32. He paused on the 32nd. He said that the 32nd death caused by Marchbrook Colourworks was his own first wife, Charlotte, who had painted with his own pigment for 6 years, and who had died in November 1847 under a certificate signed by Pemberton citing consumption, and whose death he had not challenged because challenging it would have required him to speak the truth. He had already decided not to speak. One of the commissioners, a younger man, seated to Aldford's left, set down his pen and did not pick it up again for several seconds. Pemberton said, in a voice that had lost most of its precision, "Your Grace, I must object." "You may object in your own testimony," Aldford said. "You have given it. A child was called. Her name was Mary Fallow, and she was 8 years old, and she had worked the drying room for 4 months before Rosalind's complaint had resulted in her removal. She sat in the chair the commissioners provided and answered questions in the flat, careful voice of a child who has decided not to cry in a room full of adults and is managing it successfully. She was asked whether she remembered the first Duchess. She said yes. She said the first Duchess used to come down to the drying room sometimes in the mornings before she got sick, and she would weigh out the pigment herself and write things in a small book. And she always brought the children barley sugar from a paper bag in her coat pocket, and she smelled of the green paint because she had been painting with it in the house. The child said this without tears, in the specific, matter-of-fact way that children describe things they have simply observed and stored and not yet had reason to interpret. The hearing was suspended for 14 minutes. When it resumed, Aldford looked at Pemberton for a long moment and then looked away, which was, Rosalind thought, the most devastating thing she had watched anyone do all morning. The works closed by board order on day 111. In November, Pemberton appeared before the General Medical Council and was struck from the register. His license was gone before the end of the month, and the professional record he had spent 31 false certificates protecting was worth nothing at all. Ambrose sold the dismantled works. He sold 2 farms and the Marchbrook woods, and with the proceeds established a pension for the affected families. Not a quiet, private arrangement with no public record, but a formal trust, documented, administered by a solicitor in Birmingham who had no connection to the estate and every incentive to administer it honestly. The pension ran for 12 years. Every family that had lost someone to the drying room received it. Every family that had a member still living with the effects of arsenic exposure received it. There were no exceptions and no conditions. In September, Charlotte's sick room was stripped. The work took 2 days, the paint scraped from the plaster in careful sections, each section wrapped and labeled and sent sealed to London as physical evidence for the board's formal record. When the walls were bare, Rosalind stood in the room and looked at the plaster underneath, gray-white and uneven, and thought about the woman who had painted these walls herself, who had brought the children barley sugar, who had written a letter that was never answered, who had waited. The room was lime-washed in September. The smell of fresh plaster and wet lime was clean and cold, and entirely unlike anything the room had smelled before. Rosalind opened the window. Below, in the works village, the buildings that had been the colourworks were already being cleared. The drying racks gone, the vats emptied, the loading yard quiet for the first time in 13 years. In October, the ward moved in. 6 beds, then 12, then the proper dispensary equipment that the Nursing Society had promised and delivered. Rosalind directed it. She kept the funding. The workers' collection had become a formal charitable account by this point, and she was its director. And she did not relinquish that directorship when she returned to Marchbrook as Ambrose's wife. She returned as both things. She gave back neither. The room was white now, the window open, the smell of plaster still faint in the September air. When Ambrose came in and stood beside her at the window, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the voice she had come to know as his honest one, the one that did not manage itself, the one that cost him something to use. The words he had spoken in this same doorway on the first evening, when she had carried Nell Hodges through the door and laid her on the window seat. He said them again, not as a refusal, as a correction, as the statement of a man acknowledging, aloud and without condition, what he had spent 6 years refusing to see. that the woman standing beside him in this room was the only true wife he had, the only one he deserved to call that, and that she had earned that truth not by waiting for him, but by refusing to. Rosalind looked at him for a moment. Then she shut the door from the inside. A hand put out the lamp. A son was born in March of 1854. He was named Thomas, for the boy who had died on day 8, 9 years old, in a low cottage at the end of the Works village lane. The name was entered in the parish register without ceremony. Every person at Marchbrook knew why the name had been chosen, and every person at Marchbrook said it carefully, with the particular weight given to names that have been borrowed from the dead and must be carried honestly. No one in the family said it lightly. No one ever did.